and welcome back to Circus Circuit, Unraveling Global Trade podcast. I'm your host, Kate Foronda, and today I would like to talk about a topic that sits right at the intersection of two things I truly love: global trade and industrial and organizational psychology. This episode is about behavioral biases in global trade. When people hear the word bias, they often think of personal pre-existing beliefs. But in the context of global trade, bias means something a bit different. Here, bias refers to systematic errors in judgment. One important thing to understand is that bias is not a weakness that's limited to beginners only. Bias is a human feature. It showed up in experienced traders, procurement managers, logistics professionals, executives, and even large institutions. In fact, the higher pressure and the faster decisions need to be made, the more space bias has to step in and take control. This is exactly why I find combination of global trade and Iowa psychology so fascinating. Global trade is often described as numbers, contracts, and supply chains. But behind every real deal are people who's making decisions under stress, uncertainty, and time pressure. Our psychology helps us understand how those people think, how they react, and why even very experienced professionals can fall into the same mental traps again and again. Biases can be grouped differently, but for the purpose of this episode, I combine them into three practical categories. The first group or category is behavioral biases, and this group is the foundation for everything else. They are psychological shortcuts that influence how people negotiate, assess risks, and make decisions. And if we do not understand these human behaviors, it becomes very difficult to fully understand what happens in physical markets or within trade structures. Then I will touch physical market biases, group 2. This comes from the way real commodities are produced, priced, transported, and delivered. And very often these physical elements amplify the behavior biases that people already bring into the process. And I will also mention market and structural biases, group number 3. And of course, we will also talk about how these biases can be managed and discuss real examples and case studies. Let's start with the behavior biases, the one that quietly determine trading decisions and negotiation behavior. The first and most famous one is loss aversion. This is the tendency to feel the pain of losses more strongly than the pressure of gain. A common way of describing it is that losses loom larger than gains, and many estimates put the emotional impact of a loss at roughly about twice the impact of a similar gain. So what does this look like in trading in general? It looks like holding onto a losing position too long because you cannot emotionally accept realizing the loss. It can also look like taking profits too fast because you're afraid the profit will disappear. Loss aversion is one of the psychological roots behind something that called the disposition effect, which is the habit of selling winners too early and holding losers too long. A well-known study by Professor Terence Odian looked at real brokerage accounts and found a clear pattern. Investors were much more willing to lock in gains than accept losses. In most months, people sold winning positions more often than losing ones. This behavior is a classic example of what psychologists call the disposition effect. There is also a modern real-world example that shows how this bias can be reduced. A study by National Bureau of Economic Research looked at a French brokerage firm that made one simple change. They removed gain and loss information from what advisors could see. And as a result, advisors were less likely to sell winning positions too quickly and less likely to hold until losing ones for too far or for too long. Over time, this small change made a real difference. Clients returned improved by about 0.2% per month, and that may sound small, but over the long run, it adds up to a meaningful improvement. The second major bias is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you search for information that supports your existing beliefs and you minimize or ignore information that challenged it. If you are bullish on crude oil, you start collecting bullish headlines like trophies and you quietly skip the data that makes you uncomfortable. Confirmation bias is dangerous in commodities because the market is often driven by narratives, and narratives are emotionally attractive. They feel like certainty, even when they are not. The third major bias is overconfidence. Overconfidence is when you overestimate your ability to predict the market and you underestimate uncertainty. In global trade, overconfidence can show up as taking counterparty risk too light, assuming logistics will be easy, assuming permits will be fast, which never happened, assuming sanctions screening is probably fine, or assuming price will surely revert. Overconfidence does not always look like arrogance. Sometimes it looks like optimism that is just not properly hedged. The fourth bias is anchoring bias. Anchoring happens when we fixate on a specific number and treat it as a reference point even when it's no longer relevant. In global trade, that anchor might be an old contract price, last season's freight rate, or simply the first quote we hear from a supplier. Anchoring can be very costly when market conditions have clearly changed. I have seen this many times in fertilizers market. For example, buyers place order for urea during peak season when prices are at their highest, but still expect to pay prices typical for the low season. That expectation is not based on current market reality, it's based on an outdated reference point. The same pattern appears in other commodities like wheat or soybeans, and it's especially common among novice or less experienced traders and speculators. Anchoring slows people down, and in fast-moving commodity markets, being slow to adapt can be very expensive. In trade, the smart move is to prepare for winter when it's still summer. The fifth is herd mentality. Herd mentality is following the crowd because it feels safer psychologically. Today, the crowds might be social media, Instagram, Telegram, popular analysts, or even your own desk culture. Herd behavior drives bubbles, squeezes, panic buying and panic selling, and yes, if you live through crypto cycles, you have seen this energy with your own eyes. Now, I would like to add 5 more biases that are often less discussed in beginner trading conversation, but they are very relevant in global trade and physical commodity market. One bias is called endowment effect. This is when you value something more simply because you own it. If you are long of something like some commodity position, you start defending it like it's a part of your own identity. In physical trade, this can show up when a company overvalues an inventory position because we already paid for it, even if the opportunity completely different and the cost of holding this particular commodity is rising up. Another one is recency bias. Recency bias is overweighting what just happened and underweighting longer history. For example, if wheat rallied for 3 weeks, recency bias will whisper, this is new normal. If a supplier failed last month, recency bias will tell you all suppliers from that region are risky, which is of course not true. Recency bias is emotionally efficient, but it's statistically lazy. Another bias is status quo bias. Status quo bias is a preference for keeping things as they are. In physical trade, status quo can keep a company stuck with familiar suppliers, familiar routes, familiar Incoterms, and familiar payment structures. Even when risk landscape changes, it can also prevent teams from updating internal processes because change feels uncomfortable. Another bias is cultural bias, and this matters a lot in global trade. Cultural bias is when your assumptions about how business should be done are shaped by your own cultural background. This can affect negotiation style, communication timing, trust building expectations, and conflict management. In practical terms, cultural bias can cause misreading silence as disagreement, misreading direct language as hostility, or misreading negotiation as disrespect. This is also where emotional intelligence becomes a real competitive advantage, not as a self-help concept, but as an operational skill. I truly love this topic, and I can talk a lot about emotional intelligence and conflict resolution within a culture context. But let's move on and speak a bit about emotional biases. Emotional bias is when fear, excitement, pride, or frustration drives action more than analysis. In trading, emotional bias often shows up right after a big win or big loss. After you win, you can feel invincible. After you lose, you can feel desperate to make it back. Both emotional states are dangerous because they distort risk perception. To understand those biases better, let's ground this discussion in real examples, because bias is easiest to understand when we can see how it plays out in history. A very good and clear example is the 1973 to 1974 oil shock. During the oil embargo and production cuts, prices jumped from under $3 per barrel to more than $7 in a very short period of time. This was not only a supply issue, it was also a psychology-driven event. When supply becomes uncertain, fear spreads quickly, and that fear pushed companies and government to hoard, buy forward aggressively, and secure supply at most any cost. Rational planning is replaced by panic-driven decisions. And this is a great example of herd behavior and loss aversion, just on a global scale. We see a similar pattern in food market. During 2010 and 2011 food price spike. During that period, the global food price index rose sharply and reached very high level in early 2011. Food markets are especially vulnerable because they sit among weather, energy cost, policy decision, speculations. As prices rise quickly, recency bias convinces people that this trend will continue. Loss aversion amplifies fear of shortage. Herd behavior pushes buyers to secure supply immediately, even when prices no longer reflect fundamentals. This creates a feedback loop where fear drives buying, buying drives prices higher, and rising prices reinforce fear. Another example, in 2022, global food prices reached their highest annual average on record, driven by war disruption, drought condition, and broader supply pressure. Remember the COVID times. But once again, prices reacted not only to physical constraint, to political constraint, but also to emotion and expectations. And if we zoom out, we can find the same behavioral patterns appear outside commodities. During the dot-com bubble, excitement about the internet pushed valuations far beyond reality. During the blockchain boom, Strong narratives and rising prices encouraged massive investments before regulations, before energy cost and adoption risks were fully understood. Today, we see similar dynamics around artificial intelligence. Yes, AI is real and its impact is real. But when governments, companies, and investors rush to secure energy, data centers, and infrastructure simply because others are doing the same, familiar biases take over. Fear of missing out, herd behavior, overconfidence, and powerful storytelling begin to drive decision faster than just normal, careful planning. What we will do right now, we can connect all those examples and we can see it's not just technology or commodity itself. Oil, food, internet, blockchain, AI are all real and very important, but the common thread is human behavior under uncertainty. When fear and excitement rise together, bias steps in. And when bias spreads across markets, prices and decisions can move much faster and much further than fundamentals alone would justify. That is why understanding behavioral biases is so important and so applicable. In global trade and commodities, these patterns repeat because human behavior repeats. And the cost of getting it wrong can last for years. So that was our first group, behavioral biases, and as I said, they are a foundation for all other types of biases. Now let's shift into biases that are very specific to trade. Physical commodity markets come with their own blind spot because their assets is real things. It must be stored, shipped, inspected, insured, and delivered. And this creates what I call tangibility bias. Tangibility bias is the tendency to perceive tangible assets like gold, oil, grain, or real estate as safer simply because they are real and touchable. So you can touch them, they are feasible. But physical commodities can be brutally volatile and physical supply chain can break. Tangibility does not guarantee stability, it just feels stable. Next is settlement and data bias. And this one is also my favorite topics because it's so practical. In global trade, prices depend on delivery terms. A price quoted FOB is not the same as a price quoted CIF. FOB means the seller delivers goods on board at the departure port. CIF includes cost, insurance, and freight to the destination port. Even when people say the price of oil or the price of wheat, there can be multiple realities and multiple meanings depending on delivery terms, quality, specification, timing, and inspection clauses. And when teams compare prices without aligning those terms, which has happened a lot in reality, they can create biased conclusions. They think one supplier is cheaper when they are not comparing the same product and the same economic structure. Then here is home bias in trade. Home bias is a tendency to prefer domestic goods even when there is no objective quality advantage. In consumer markets, this is often discussed as ethnocentrism. A modern research continues to analyze how moral and cultural preferences drive this behavior. In physical commodity trade, home bias can show up as domestic feels safer, even when the real risk factor is completely different. It can be logistic reliability, credit terms, quality, consistency. Home bias can be rational sometimes, but it can also be emotional comfort that is presented as some real strategy. Now let's focus on market and structural biases, because markets are not only psychology, they are also about structure. There are broader forces and patterns that shape trade behavior and price movement over time. And they can exist even before emotions are turned on. But it's important to remember that markets and structure are still created and maintained by people, which means human behavior always remains part of the picture. I know this episode may be longer than my previous ones, and I don't want to bore you too much, so I'll keep this part brief. There are three main biases in this category: structural bias, daily bias, and liquidity bias. If you are interested in learning more about them, feel free to let me know, reach me, and you can also look them up online and explore how these biases work specifically in the context of commodity trading. Their key idea I want to share here. We all deal with biases, and it's absolutely normal. What matters is making sure those biases do not become us. Because when a bias turns into identity, we stop adapting. Now, let's move to the question everyone asks. How do we manage bias? First, awareness is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Awareness is like seeing the storm, but you still need a shelter. One of the most effective shelters is rule-based decision-making. That means having predefined entry and exit criteria. In trade deals, rules can mean supplier qualification criteria, contract red flags, mandatory risk checks, and pre-approved escalation path. The goal is not to remove human judgment. The goal here is to prevent the emotional brain from hiking the moment. Second is top-down analysis. In global trade, it means checking the micro context before reacting to daily noise. Are we in a structural supply deficit or surplus? Are freight rates tightening? Are regulations shifting? Is demand seasonal? Top-down analysis reduces recency bias and prevents daily bias from becoming tunnel vision. Third is risk management, and this is where a professional separates themselves from amateurs. Risk management is not pessimism, it's respect for uncertainty. In our context, it means diversification of suppliers and routes, hedging strategy discipline, insurance clarity, and credit risk control. You can also use practical tools like checklist, pre-mortem, second opinions. By the way, second opinion is not a sign of weakness. It's a bias filter. It forces you to explain your logic out loud, and that alone can expose faulty assumptions. Finally, one of the most underrated bias management tools is information design. If the way information is presented triggers bias, you should change the presentation. Remember the early example where removing gain and loss indicators from the advisor view helped reduce the disposition effect and improved outcome in that brokerage context. That is a powerful lesson. Sometimes we don't need more discipline. Sometimes we need better systems. Markets are not driven only by supply and demand. They are driven by perception, stress, shortcuts, and structure. In global trade, bias is even more powerful because the stakes are real, the logistics are complex, and the feedback loops can be fast. If you're a trader, broker, procurement lead, or a founder who is building a trade-driven business, your competitive edge is not only your market knowledge. It is your ability to stay disciplined while others get emotional. It's your ability to slow down when everyone speeds up. And it's your ability to separate a story from a signal. This was Circus and Circuit Unraveling Global Trade podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who lives inside markets because we all have biases, and the best traders are not the ones without biases, they are the ones who manage it. I'm Kate Foronda, and see you next time.